Hello, my name is Eva Howe, and welcome to GraphQL Fireside Chats, platform and data-centric use cases with GraphQL. This is going to be just a very casual conversation amongst a couple of people who are very knowledgeable in the subject. Our sponsors today are Hasura and the Stot Labs. I'm with the Stot Labs, and Tanmai is with Hasura. And then upcoming events, we're going to do these over the next couple of weeks. So we've got one coming up on April 21st, and that's going to be performance and monitoring tips, tricks, and caveats with GraphQL. And then we've got one coming up on April 28th, which will be authorization and security patterns for GraphQL with Gago. I'm not even going to attempt. And then we've got one coming up on May 12th, event-driven applications with GraphQL and serverless with Christian and Simona. Today, we've got Tanmai from Hasura, we've got Sasha from Twitter, we have Alex from Moon Highway and Eve from Moon Highway, and I will hand it over to Tanmai to start. Did we lose Tanmai again?
Sorry, what?
I think we lost you again. There you are.
Okay. All right. I'm back. All right. Hi, everyone. Great to be here, and hope you all are doing well and safe in the pandemic times. This conversation is going to be super interesting, and I'm very happy for kind of our panelists here. We'll be talking a little bit about slightly atypical use cases of GraphQL, platform, and what I call platform and data-centric use cases, which are primarily APIs that are being used by maybe the rest of your team, by other teams inside the same organization, or maybe it's used to provide an API integration to developers outside your organization. One of the best examples of a platform API is GitHub's GraphQL API, which is not really an API that's necessarily meant for building front-end applications, but for developers to kind of browse the various objects and entities that the GitHub API exposes. So very excited to be talking about that. And as we kind of get into that conversation, it'd be best to start with a little bit of an introduction of the guest that we have today. So Sasha, if you'd like to quickly maybe introduce yourself and talk a little bit about what you've been doing with GraphQL and how you've been using GraphQL so far.
Yeah, so I'm Sasha. I'm currently a software engineer at Twitter, and I used to be the tech lead of the platforms team at Medium, and we were using GraphQL at both. And I guess basically using GraphQL to power the main apps, so all of the like iOS and Android, and then also the web client, both at Twitter and at Medium. But yeah, I've been just helping use GraphQL and helping get folks moved over to GraphQL. So in both cases, kind of like a migration from REST.
Got it. And how far is Twitter into their kind of GraphQL journey? Are most of the APIs GraphQL, a little bit here and there?
A lot of, so all of the Twitter owned and operated clients are on GraphQL. It's still like, mid-process, but we're like fairly far along. So that's like the main like canonical way of building product features now at Twitter is using GraphQL.
Got it. Awesome. Eve and Alex, would you like to talk a little bit about, what kind of stuff, what kind of projects you've been doing at Moon Highway with GraphQL, what kind of different use cases you've seen, and of course, a quick introduction.
Sure. So we're Eve and Alex. We work at Moon Highway, and we teach GraphQL. So we work a lot with taking teams who aren't familiar with GraphQL and getting everybody on the same page. So our area of focus lately has been, how do you take everyone on the team? So literally anyone who would be dealing with data in any sense, how do you get them to get excited about GraphQL first and foremost, and then to really understand how to use GraphQL to their benefit? So we've been teaching a lot of workshops for like project managers and folks who might not think of themselves as, needing GraphQL, and then teaching them that in fact, it's going to help them have more control over their applications and the process of development. And backend folks too. So
yeah, if it fits into the stuff, we're trying to really cast a wide net and bring more people under the fold of GraphQL than just developers right now. And we've had a lot of success of doing that with like product owners and project managers and so on and so forth, which gets everybody in the room to help design the schema and to help make sense out of it. And it really fits in with some of the stuff that we're talking about today, because we wonder what it would be like to show up to an organization and like just interact with everything that you need internally at that organization through something like the playground and whatnot. So
Yep. That's kind of exactly one of the things that I've been seeing, which is that what people really like about GraphQL is a lot of people don't like building GraphQL as much as they like consuming GraphQL. So if you give somebody a GraphQL API, they're very happy because they're like, oh, look, I can browse of like, everything that's there in my schema. And then all of the actions that these entities have, right? As especially some of the work that, so for example, like Sean has been doing at OneGraph, we're building out a lot of GraphQL tooling to make the API exploration easier, and like lots of nice documentation tooling, which is just like a order of magnitude improvement over whatever API exploration and integration tools people have. And of course, one of the big challenges there is that the kind of middleware tooling for GraphQL being an API between like service to service, right, in a sense, is obviously missing a little bit, right? So that's kind of been one of the challenges. What would it be kind of interesting to hear? Kind of when I say things like a platform or data-centric API, what that kind of means to you, and what are the use cases that you've encountered that you think where you think it would shine, right? Like for example, just to take two kind of examples that I've seen in the wild. One are in large enterprises, right? For example, imagine like a large healthcare organization, right? You have so many different teams, so many different business verticals. That people and that kind of browsing the API or like a platform API that might be organization wide or might span a bunch of teams is very painful. It requires a tremendous amount of tooling and setup and education, and GraphQL could potentially help with that. The same way that GraphQL has been helping front-end developers build complex applications today, and kind of browsing the various entities and the actions that you can take on those entities or the transactions you can run. The other kind of use case that I've also encountered is a very data-specific use case where teams have kind of their own data, and they want to expose that data to other teams inside the organization. And they obviously don't want to give direct access to the database. They want to have like a layer in the middle where they can enforce some governance rules, do some kind of traffic management, right? Understand what consumers are using, what slices of their data, right? What is more frequently queried or less frequently queried, and stuff like that. So those kinds of use cases within the enterprise, I've seen quite a bit of appetite for people wanting to use GraphQL, and then kind of getting caught in a few places or where GraphQL, building GraphQL services is hard. And especially kind of like an open-ended API, right? So you lose a lot of like the persistent queries benefit. And on the other end, people who are kind of consuming this GraphQL API, they face problems with the different kind of GraphQL clients that they have. But those are kinds of the use cases that I've seen where I think there would be a benefit to having a GraphQL API for platform use case or a data use case. I'm just wondering if you've encountered stuff where you think it would have been useful. Sasha, do you have any examples that you've seen at Medium or Twitter or just generally in life?
I'm not sure if I've encountered specifically a case where it would have been particularly useful, but I think maybe that's something people will end up seeing as more folks kind of get into the more like kind of like mature end of GraphQL. I think especially in the last few years, GraphQL has kind of matured a lot. So I think thinking about like as people kind of start using GraphQL more and kind of like are getting into it, like large scale applications are built with GraphQL. I think like looking into kind of like the backend services and seeing how GraphQL could play in there is something that's interesting. And I think the reason a lot of this doesn't end up happening is because folks have already built out a lot of those services,
right,
and they're already using something. So kind of the same with like, client side and using GraphQL, like, you kind of, at least from my perspective, weirdly, a lot of the backend folks were driving GraphQL at like all the companies I've worked at. All the backend developers are really excited about it to like help out clients because like that contract is so weird.
Right.
And so I think it took a lot of like selling and like getting, client developers excited. And I think it would probably be, it seems like it's the same kind of thing where it's like, if you've been working a certain way for so long, you might not realize that like this is something you would want or need. But I think there's something there. I don't know if GraphQL is like, at least, or folks are like, have been using GraphQL long enough to know how that will look.
Right. And have you seen and have you come across examples of using external services like APIs provided by external like SaaS vendors that use GraphQL, right? Like for example, GitHub has a GraphQL API, or I don't actually know too many other examples of vendors that provide a GraphQL API alongside their REST API. But even things like I think so. For example, what OneGraph is doing, where they're trying to create like wrap over a bunch of different SaaS services and provide a GraphQL API. Have you seen cases like that, or what do you feel about cases like that, given the kinds of things that you've worked on the back end?
I think so, at least maybe I'm wrong, and maybe eventually like everyone will be using GraphQL and it'll just be like, the new thing to use, and no one will use REST anymore. I think even at Twitter, a lot of public facing APIs won't use GraphQL, and at Twitter, even our public facing API it still uses REST. And for like third party related things, we still use REST. Weirdly, for us, it's also powered by GraphQL just under the hood, but on top we provide REST endpoints, and like under that they're actually just using GraphQL. So that's like maybe the one case where we're actually using GraphQL sort of for like a service to, not service to service, but sort of, yeah.
Got it. And I'm guessing the use case there is that it's kind of like it's almost like a persisted query in a sense, right? Like a REST API is kind of like is like a persisted GraphQL query. Does that make sense? Is that the reason why?
Yeah.
Yeah.
The whole, we're big on the like ad hoc query thing, that like blows people's minds when you talk about it. You're like, well, really GraphQL is just a bunch of ad hoc endpoints, sorry. And so, yeah, people get excited about that. But yeah, because for providing like third party like customers with a REST endpoint, that's easier for them, and you can kind of like tie down like what exactly they can like query for by just making it like a REST endpoint. But then under the hood, they're just making a query, and our GraphQL service already had all of the, it supported all of the things that the folks making the public like third party APIs already needed. So
yeah. I remember there's a very nice tool that Uri and the Guild folks have worked on called, I think they call it Sofa. Am I right? Like Sofa it's a REST to GraphQL converter. It's like basically a REST API gateway for your GraphQL service, which kind of helps you automate a little bit of that effort. What kind of like in terms of like from the GraphQL service that you have running today, are there kind of tools that you have around, kind of tools that you set up for doing some of that kind of traffic management or API governance kind of stuff that we see very commonly for API gateways? But has any of that kind of tooling has any of that started to get built inside Twitter or Medium, where or just stuff that you've come across where handling the problem of being able to make queries, whatever query you want in production, like kind of like the way GitHub's GraphQL API is. Has there been any kind of movement on that side?
Not necessarily tooling, but like there's, obviously a bunch of like existing things for metrics that, Twitter uses and Medium uses and a bunch of companies use. But the main thing is, so people can't like, DDoS anybody. We do what I think a lot of people do, which is we like whitelist. We have like query IDs and we whitelist them. So there's only specific queries that you can make. And if you try to make anything else, it like won't work. And that seems to be pretty good. Medium had just started doing things like query complexity to help with that too. But that's something that you have to be really,
careful about.
I don't know how. Yeah, you have to go through and like each field, like how what's the weight on this, and it's kind of a whole thing. I would love to see something more around that, because I think that's something that's really cool. But
yeah. So yeah, it's very interesting also, because like it's not necessarily like the ergonomics also of a dynamic query complexity analysis is also kind of weird, right? Because you might even if it is possible to do, like for example, with the work that we are doing at Hasura, it's quite easy for us to determine the cost of a GraphQL query because we have deep insight into the database and into the other services that we're querying. So it's easy to kind of put together that cost dynamically, but it might not be good to expose that as a service level control to the consumer, as a quality of service level control to the consumers, because you might suddenly notice that suddenly some queries work that did not work before. Like from an integration standpoint, it's not very ideal to have queries that sometimes work and sometimes don't work. You know what I mean? Like in development, this worked, but at 5 p.m. it doesn't work because the dynamic kind of cost analysis has said that this query is too expensive. So,
right. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. So there's challenges there as well. Alex and Eve, like what kind of, when we talk about like the platform and data-centric APIs, what kind of excites you about those use cases? And, what kind of challenges do you think that are kind of there that need to be solved to kind of push towards that kind of reality?
One thing that's interesting, and I find this like that Sasha just said, it's like still REST is easier to work with for clients. So a lot of it is just working knowledge. Like when people understand GraphQL, you don't have to explain that to them. So part of the whole like training or onboarding or anything is like, okay, well, here's where our APIs are. And if everybody knows already how to go search for queries and how to do those queries and whatnot, that's you reach like, that's what you need in order to really communicate around this. The fact that when I started in the work world, it seemed like everybody knew SQL. Like everybody's college had an access course, no matter what you were doing. And when you would show up to places, like we used to have at this one consulting agency I worked with, we used to have a receptionist that was a graphic artist, but she also did all of the student administration for our classes. And like no one said, hey, this is SQL and so on and so forth. We were just like, here's the database. We need to know like what students are in. When a student registers, you need to insert them there. And like, so I feel like it's just like broadening the knowledge of understanding, because there's really like, oh, you need to get data. Well, that's a query. And here you can see the schema. Oh, you need to change something. Well, that's a mutation. And right now we're teaching that when we're teaching how to access the API and stuff. And then if we get really excited and we start showing like all of the advanced stuff you can do, you start to really overwhelm the people who are coming in. And I think that's part of the reason that REST and things like that are still easier, like.
Yeah.
So knowledge and just getting everybody on the same page. So you're like, okay, GraphQL, great. So we don't have to have those conversations about those things. You could just kind of cut people loose on APIs and stuff like that.
Yeah.
And I think that's when it comes down to like GitHub and things like that, people are still using the REST APIs, like the GraphQL API is something that maybe people have tinkered with and played with, but when it comes down to it, like sending those REST queries, they already have it in their wheelhouse. And it's also like a little less complicated. The GitHub API, you have to make sure you have a key that you send to do queries that you could do publicly without a key, and the REST API and stuff like that. So a lot of it's just like lowering the barrier to access.
Got it.
But the other thing that sorry, go ahead.
No, sorry, go ahead.
I was just going to say the other thing about it is it really is about communication too. So what we really come across is this. Or like, think about this use case. You're at a startup, right? And you have all of this domain data. You have like customers, you have users, and then you have people come into that startup. And ideally, you want to build your employees all these great internal tools and all these great internal clients that have like great interfaces and stuff. But if you're moving fast, you don't have time to do that. So if you're building your domain and stuff like that out of GraphQL anyways, you can have people come in and begin to get the data they need and begin to send the mutations they need. One of the features that I love of the Playground is just, okay, so you can write the query and then save it in that tab. And then every time you open the Playground, just hit play. It already describes the data that you need to do your Excel report or whatever. But what's really key to making that work is schema design that makes sense, like good schema design for human beings and for human consumers. Because what we see sometimes is that the schema has been designed by super technical developers, and it doesn't make sense to like everybody like on the team. It doesn't make sense necessarily to project managers and stuff like that, because as opposed to using good domain language for what what I'm saying, that makes sense to everybody who works at an organization. There's a lot of like underscore db lose stuff that's within the schema, and that's also a barrier to entry. So a lot of it is just about like knowledge and understanding, but also making your actual schema for your API super approachable.
Makes sense. And I think looking back at like university, I remember that there was a course on web technologies or something, and there was this professor who was we were talking about SOAP and WSDL, And I was like, what is even happening? And this is just like 5-10 years ago. I'm like, why are we talking even about soap? But you know, I mean, considering that was the lag, I think yes, it makes sense that there is definitely kind of like a default tool set problem that's that REST has kind of been through, has kind of crossed, because it's been a while. One of the things though that I've also encountered is a challenge, especially in enterprise environments, right? Is so one of the things that kind of blew my mind a few years ago was realizing that most of the APIs in the world are actually internal APIs. So it's like, turns out that 95% of the APIs are not actually APIs that backend serve to front-end applications, which, I mean, why would it be? It's just me being a noob. But most of the applications, actually, most APIs that exist today are mostly like service to service, or, you know, business to business, or team to team, right? Something like that. You know, whatever the API consumer does with it. And I think, and I think that because of that kind of pervasiveness of APIs doing so much work, right? It becomes really important that the APIs are simple to build, so it's easy to kind of build stand up a REST API, and the tooling around REST APIs kind of keeps improving, right? So there is that, but there's also the element of like the rest of the kind of ecosystem tooling, right? So for example, the way you think about the way one thinks about like authorization, like resource level authorization, right? So you have REST endpoints, and REST endpoints have authorization that's tied into like authentication systems that, you know, enterprise systems have, right? And there's so much tooling that's kind of happened there for REST, that kind of tooling is missing seems to be missing for GraphQL, or at least that's what I encounter from whenever I chat to people in enterprise and they're kind of thinking about GraphQL. You know, those are kinds of some of the things that they're worried about, that they think about. How has have you encountered any of these kinds of things, Alex and Eve, like in kind of like when you're talking to backend developers in terms of their concerns with, you know, using GraphQL for building out their API? You know, what have you seen there, and what do you say to them?
I think,
and Sasha's case is totally different, because they're like, oh, we're backend developers and we all want to use GraphQL.
Yeah.
Everybody else does.
Yeah, not always the case at our courses, but yeah, I think for the most part, the first kind of dip your toe into the pond of GraphQL is always like a client story. Like, how do we load some data into our user interface? And then the internal APIs, perhaps just because client developers might be a little more excited in a lot of cases, they start to, I don't know, we haven't seen as much internal tooling about that. We've seen a lot of questions about like, how do I take my Excel? I ask this question with this database and or Excel or something like that. How do we port that over to GraphQL? And I think that, yeah, just tooling and knowledge around that stuff would be interesting. What else?
Yeah, it's just like using the playground for authors. It's more about how all of the authorization gets built in, and how you do those levels, or query complexity, or user roles, and what they're allowed to access, and so on and so forth.
Right.
And I think that stuff is an interesting, like, those are complications that like are part of just like the world of programming, I think. But one of the most interesting things is like a lot of the backend people we teach, JavaScript isn't their world.
Yeah.
It's usually like Python or Java and stuff like that. So it's like a lot of the stuff that we're teaching is still in JavaScript, but like we're not just selling GraphQL, we're selling JavaScript too. And sometimes that's a hard sell. Unlike backend people, like
Sasha's laughing.
Yeah.
And so what is the GraphQL stack? What are the, I think if I remember right, it was Scala at Medium for you, Sasha, and then at Twitter is it Scala too?
Yeah, it's Scala at both. Weirdly, Medium's kind of like a special case. Medium stack was mainly so like JavaScript, and it was, I won't get into the specifics about like what different things we use for on the front end, because I was not a front end developer and I probably can't really say because I don't know. But the backend was mostly Node.js, and then we had a bunch of like different Go services. And originally our GraphQL server was written in Go. I don't know if there's like Go fans out there anywhere, but it weirdly, like GraphQL and Go, at least to me, when we built the GraphQL server, just it doesn't really fit quite well. like just how like the types work out, and like Go still I think does not support generics. So it was like a whole thing. So we tried it out and it didn't work at all. There was like a lot of like reflection going on. So we ended up rewriting it in Scala. So that's how it ended up being in Scala, but nothing else at Medium was in Scala. So that was kind of like a different challenge in itself. It was getting folks onto GraphQL and kind of like into Scala at the same time. But for the front end developers, it was kind of like the promise of GraphQL and React. It's like if we switch to GraphQL, you also get React because we're gonna do this like whole migration. So that was kind of part of the selling point, was like you get these two awesome things. So
right. What kind of like tooling did you have to set up for doing the stuff around, like how did you handle kind of like the security tooling and the DDoS protection tooling? Like what was that like?
There's not a lot of there. I mean, both at Medium and Twitter, there's not a lot of like tooling around those types of things. It's kind of a lot of it is sort of baked into what we already do, which is sort of unfortunate. And I think, I think this is, everyone probably agrees with this, but GraphQL, I feel like a lot of the like at least the auth stuff is just, it's a little clunky. And on the like even the GraphQL kind of like docs and kind of how they explain like, this is maybe how you could do like authorization stuff, it still feels a little clunky. And I think that's something that is, I don't know if that's anyone's kind of like looked into that more, or has come up with like kind of like a easier way to do it. But I think that's part of one of the challenges when people kind of migrate to GraphQL is like it's not super clear or easy to do that as it is in REST. So yeah.
I think, and one of the things that has worked well for our users and the way that we do things is that we specify kind of a lot of the times like the authorization logic ends up being very kind of close to the data fetching logic. Right? It's fairly close to like the data that you're fetching kind of contains the constraint for whether that piece of data is accessible or not, right? Or maybe because when you're kind of making that data fetch to a bunch of different data sources, that the authorization check is also very closely related to that. And oftentimes it turns out that you're doing that work twice. And what we've noticed seems to be easier from just like reasoning about the entire system is to kind of create an abstraction for putting in authorization very at the model level, right? So each kind of model has its own authorization checks, and so now when the resolvers kind of fetch these models, however you fetch all of these models, whatever path you take from the resolver, like you fetch top level user and their tweets, or you fetch like the tweet and their user, right? Like you're taking different paths to fetch the same model. The authorization constraints automatically get mixed in and deduplicated and linked with the data fetch logic, right? Which results in a huge like a performance boost as well, but also just like it's easier to reason about things, right? Because it's easier to, it's especially in like these kind of platformy kind of environments, it's very easy to think about like, oh, here's a health record for a patient. This health record is accessible if, right? It's easier to think in that kind of object model rather than thinking about it at a resolver level, that if we access data this particular way, then we'll have authorization checks. So that's kind of one thing that we've seen, especially for like the platform and data-centric use cases that work really well. It's kind of like embedding those authorization constraints at the model level in a way that it plays with the data fetch logic well. But I'm wondering how, what experiences you folks have had and what you've seen with respect to authorization and what seems to work so far.
Actually, can I ask you a question about that?
Sure.
So
go ahead.
When you tie these authorization to the model, how do you set up your users? Is it like a role-based system, or would you say it's like permission-based system? Like you have read access to this model or something like that. How do you go about setting that up?
Yeah, it's kind of a rule. It's basically a rule engine, and rules. Every rule has a label. So you can create rules, and rules have labels, and then to every model you can attach a set of labels. So labels are basically like the name of the rule, right? So you can say that this model for a label called user or administrator or editor, these are the rules. And now if anybody comes to access this model through a resolver, like however, ultimately it will get accessed. If that incoming kind of request has these labels, then use those rules. to validate against. And the rules themselves could be something like, access this document if you're a paid user, or access this document if the document.groups contains you, or the document.groups.editors contains your current user or whatever, right? So the rules can be arbitrarily complex, right? And they can depend either on the user or the data. And then that kind of rule engine, and so now when the data fetch happens, so when you kind of need to make the data fetch to fetch that data and say, select this document, that constraint actually gets compiled into the query itself. So it becomes like select from document where, and that happens. So if it can't be compiled in, then it's kind of still done after, like it's a post after you do the data fetch, you check. But that's kind of one way that we've been thinking about authorization that makes it very convenient, because then you're kind of independent of resolvers, right? You're like, oh, whatever the resolvers do is fine, because ultimately, if I know that if this model is fetched, it will always be fetched with the right rule and check that will happen. So that kind of has worked well so far. But I don't know. What have you seen for authorization? Or like what works well for authorization?
We're just, everything that we do is just simply like identify the user and then send a token over the channel, and then like, oh, you're logged in, yeah, you're allowed to access everything. So that's why I was like curious. So we've discussed with our students who ask these questions, we'll get on the whiteboard, and draw out how to make a roles-based system, and that's why I'm sort of fascinated about this stuff, like rules authorization. We want to know what those patterns are and stuff. But yeah, we haven't really done like too much specific stuff with that. So
got it. Yeah, that'd be interesting to talk about. I'm sorry, Sasha, you were saying.
So one of the things that's sort of interesting about this is we're kind of, getting into like how like data access, and it's sort of, in some ways, it's not really a GraphQL like specific issue, right? It's like it's related to GraphQL, and I think with GraphQL people, get into it. And I think so, like when I talk about, and I think when y'all are talking about, like you just like pass a token, it's like, well, yeah, it's like, at the GraphQL level, there's not like a lot that's going on, but it's kind of interesting what happens below that. And I think that sort of gets into maybe gets into like the Apollo Federation stuff. It's like we're kind of like at that level. And like for Twitter, it's sort of similar to what you were talking about, Tanmai. I think we use like Strato, which is a thing that no one else can use because it's like a Twitter specific thing. But it's like the virtual database thing that sits on top of a bunch of other Twitter services. And at that level, that's where a lot of like the constraints and like permissions and stuff are defined. It's like you can access this, like it has these permissions on this like column. We call them columns. And like depending on like what gets passed through, you may or may not be able to access the data that column provides.
Right. Yeah. That makes sense. And then I'm guessing like that kind of Strato system does the optimizations to make sure that the auth stuff and the data fetch stuff is all kind of done appropriately.
A lot of that is done at it kind of depends. A lot of it's done at the GraphQL layer. We do like a bunch of caching and stuff, but there's other stuff that happens. I mean, there's a whole bunch of stuff that's going on, but yeah, there's optimizations and stuff that happen at kind of like all the levels.
Yeah. No, that makes sense. Like, I think like, for example, like one of the, I got into GraphQL very accidentally. Like we were building a data access layer with JSON, and we had our own JSON based query language and whatnot first. And then we were like, oh, okay, cool. So it seems like GraphQL seems like a better JSON API than you inventing your own API. And so a lot of these problems are things that we kind of thought about. And then when I discovered that you have to essentially write these authorization rules differently for each resolver, I was mind blown. I felt like smashing my head against a wall a little bit, because it's very confusing. Because for example, if I want to fetch, like, let's say I want to query comments, right? I know that there's an authorization check there. And then if I want to query a document and the document's comments, right? The document.comments resolver is kind of different from the comments resolver, right? They're both like different resolver functions. And that means that I have to duplicate like my authorization check in both of these places. And then sometimes it's not optimal, because when I'm doing documents.comments, the authorization check is implicit in the fetch, because I am fetching documents and comments together. But when I'm fetching comments just by themselves, I need to check if the comment.document is accessible for the end user. You know what I mean, right? Like it's they're different optimizations, but the same logical rule, like it's the same logical concept that we have from a security point of view, but it has to be implemented differently. And the trade-offs are weird, except like if you do it at the model level and the system does it for you, like you have an intelligent data access system that does it for you, then it's great. But if you don't, then it's very painful. So yeah, I basically have I don't know what to do about this. So that's been something that I've thought about quite a bit. One of the things that it does seem to me that is easier in REST is because REST kind of seems like you are fetching the entire resource at one time, right? Like you're fetching, let's say, for example, you have a resource that fetches document with comments or something. It does seem that all of the any kind of optimizations that you would want to do, or any kind of security checks that you would want to do, might be easier because you a priori know what the final result that the end user wants is, right? Except in GraphQL, you don't know at a code level, what data the user wants. So all of these checks become a little more complicated. Do you have any thoughts around that, or like how to handle that, or how that trade-off has been, or whether that trade-off makes sense? Sasha, for like the
that's a question that I would also like the answer to. This is like a this is like a GraphQL existential question, but I think about this a lot where like, for example, if is this person allowed to see this thing or not? This is like something, it's like I block this person, so they're not allowed to see it anymore. And that sort of it's works really well with like a REST centric kind of model. It's like, okay, for this endpoint, these like rules are applied, and so like only these people are able to access this or whatever. But with GraphQL, it's like, because you have like ad hoc endpoints now. It's like, how do you apply certain like who can see this rules to every single like ad hoc endpoint, each query that you make, like where does that go? And it feels like it doesn't really fit as well. I think with REST, it seems very easy. You're just like, oh, just apply these rules to this endpoint, and that's that's there. But with GraphQL, it's like, because you can have so many of these that are all queries, it's like, how do you apply rules like that to queries? And
right.
I think, a lot of people, I think like we're passing in just like parameters, and that's just kind of how it is. It's like we kind of have to take like the REST model and kind of like shove it into GraphQL, and it doesn't feel right, but that's what we've been doing. So I don't know if anyone has a better idea, but I'm also looking for answers.
Yeah.
We've seen REST endpoints that do similar checks. Like, for instance, like, it's not just, okay, we'll just give you the whole payload of data. It's like, okay, well, you meet these roles, so your data response is a little bit bigger. You get like some more secure data, or you might end up with some like null fields. So we have seen these endpoints that aren't just blanket, like, here's the whole resource. And I think the GitHub API is like a good example of that. If you're like logged in, you can see your private repos on the same query that you would send for all repos, and like their REST endpoint is also like that. So I'm curious, because there is a little bit of that already going on with like REST, like how we bring that.
Yeah, makes sense. On kind of a related topic to like the security aspect, right? The business of like the persisted queries thing, right? Like that solution works really well for kind of like the client-centric or the app-centric use case, where you always know what kind of queries people are going to use. If you're building a front-end application, right, like by the time you go from staging to production, you are either through some automated tooling or just by brute force of somebody going in and looking at every single module and extracting the GraphQL queries, right? You at least have some theoretical way of knowing what queries you're going to have to handle in production, right? Which does make a lot of like dealing with this easier. But for public-facing APIs, it's hard. Like there's no way of like the GraphQL GitHub API has no way of knowing like what queries they're going to see in production, right? And they still have to maintain production level like NFRs or quality of service requirements. So what kind of tooling have you seen in place right now that does the persisted queries thing, and have you been thinking about approaches, or are you looking at certain approaches where you don't need to use persisted queries, but you could do something else? Maybe to kick things off, Sasha, what kind of the persisted queries mechanism do you have at persisted queries or allow listed queries do you have at Twitter? How does How does that life cycle work?
I mean, it's not very exciting. There's not like a ton of tooling around it either. But basically, when client folks are creating queries, they'll create one and they can test with it in development. And basically, how our graphical is a little fancier than the vanilla graphical, but it allows you to save queries, and it'll give you a query ID. Or basically just like plopping that in a database along with the query itself. So when it goes to production, they just you can say like they hard code the actual query ID, and then we'll do a lookup when it comes to the GraphQL server.
Okay. So the entire tooling is that's very different though. The entire tooling is like, it's kind of like runtime tooling. It's not it doesn't go through your CI/CD. Like usually what people like, the usual approaches that I've seen are, people take they kind of do a static analysis on their app. Like either they have like a GraphQL document or something, or with Relay you have like a Relay compiler that kind of extracts all of these queries. And then a part of like the process of going live is when you submit like this document of allow listed queries to the server, and then the server has IDs for them. But it's kind of a part of it's a build step. Like every server has a finite list of queries that it will accept, as opposed to the check that you're talking about, where everything just happens at runtime. People just kind of save their queries, get the query ID, and use that query ID in production, and then all of the lookups happen dynamically. Is that correct?
There is a list of whitelisted queries, so you can still only make certain queries, so that like query ID will get added.
Right.
But we still will. We basically on the GraphQL server will make the lookup for that query ID and unpack it on the server side.
Got it.
And we'll do. I think we do like validation on that query once, and then once we've done it, we'll not do it again until.
Until it changes, right? Yeah, makes sense. Or it's not there. That's very interesting though. But so it's basically not a part of the build step. There's no like .graphql documents file in the source code that gets compiled out, and there's a release that happens with that list of queries, right? It's completely like that lookup basically happens at runtime. Like you know what I mean?
Yeah, the lookup itself happens at runtime. So that query ID will get looked up when the client makes the query.
Got it. That's interesting. Yeah. What about you, Eve and Alec? What kind of things have you seen with the whole allow listing workflow, and what do people do?
I don't even know that our.
I have a feeling that your answer is they don't.
They don't. Yeah, I found that they don't. I think it could be interesting to have tools around that. I see that like if you're a data analyst or something like that, running recurring queries to find out the data that you need to, I don't know, populate whatever tool you're working on. But at this point, we've seen not a whole lot of that. Yeah, I'm looking at you like, have you ever seen that? Because I don't think people have gone that far with it. So yeah, it's interesting.
Yeah, we have a fun variant of this tool, which is kind of like what Sasha was talking about, but it's kind of more, it's kind of based on query capture. So basically what happens is that as your systems are running in dev or staging or production, the queries are basically being captured, and then you can just dynamically add them to an allow list, and then that check will happen at runtime. So the process is very similar to what Sasha was describing, but I think the difference is that we don't require the developers to explicitly save the GraphQL query and then use the ID in their apps, right, Sasha? That's what you were saying. What the way it works right now is that as if I was the app developer, I would not actually use the raw GraphQL query in my app. In my app, I would say GraphQL client ID and then make the fetch.
Mm-hmm.
Got it. That's interesting. And does that work with like fragments and stuff as well, or on the client?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it does.
Oh, that's interesting. Yeah, that sounds hard also. I'm not sure. Okay, that's very interesting.
It's always kind of weird talking about Twitter specific stuff. Like Medium's kind of like a better example of like probably what like the majority of people are doing. Like they also didn't do query IDs for the longest time, and that's like pretty normal, especially when you're starting out. Twitter is so strange because it's like huge, and there's all these like weird specific things that we have to do. So it's kind of weird talking about like, oh, like, well, you store it here, and like that's how the clients work. And like, for example, the clients at Medium were obviously all using I think like Apollo for both like for iOS, Android, and for the web client. At Twitter, it's all like homegrown. We don't use Apollo for better or for worse, but we've, the client teams have all built their own like parsers and everything. So it's just kind of, it's like, oh, that seems hard. It's like, well, they built their own specific thing around it, so it works. And yeah, so it's always kind of weird talking about it because it's like always very, very like, Twitter specific. So I don't know. Sometimes it doesn't like relate as well to like everyone else.
Yeah, I've been looking at the relay documentation for the last few days, and I've been diving, and there's so many places in the docs where it says, this used to be a thing that used to be required for relay specs, but it's not anymore because it turned out it was just an FBism. Like the word for that particular was FBism. So I guess when Twitter starts kind of like talking more about their tools and open sourcing them, Sasha, wink, wink, hint, hint, as you do. You can have things like Twitterisms that go out with like, this is a Twitterism. That's I think that's very interesting. And I think and are there kind of approaches or things that you're excited about in terms of like the dynamic analysis of GraphQL queries, or like if you've given that any thought, like what kind of approaches seem to make sense? Suppose this was a GraphQL API at runtime, and we had to decide how to do rate limiting or how to do some kind of like traffic management or quality of service, or what queries are allowed and what queries are not. Any kinds of, or maybe just like tools or approaches that you've read that you'd like to point out? What are you guys even reading these days, huh? How are you spending your quality time if you're not reading up on the most pertinent problem of the denial of service problem with GraphQL? Such a big problem. Everybody's so worried about it. Everybody's freaking out. All the backend enterprise developers are just like, no, this sucks. GraphQL doesn't make sense. I can DOS your server. Here's a query. Doosh. So yeah, that's been a problem. That's literally like the first problem. Every time first time they look at GraphQL, they're like, oh, really? This sucks. Look at this GraphQL query and try executing this. Right, but yeah, that's been an interesting challenge. I think one of the things that I'm most excited about is is kind of like that GraphQL to REST builder. I feel like that might be a really nice kind of stopgap or bridge, or it might actually just be the final solution as well, right? Where you kind of have these GraphQL query templates that essentially become REST endpoints. That does sound very exciting because it kind of like addresses the backend developer problem, but it also gives you the convenience of GraphQL, where you're kind of like composing that endpoint. It's almost like it's like a fast REST API creator, right? Where you're just like, oh, here's my DSL. I can create a GraphQL query, map that to a REST endpoint. What is the use case that you have that you're using this for, Sasha?
It's mostly for our our third-party APIs. So we have customers who want to access like some Twitter data, and so they'll just be provided a bunch of REST endpoints. So it's pretty much and this. I mean, I'm interested to see how this kind of plays out, because in my head, unless people like everyone starts using GraphQL, it'll probably continue, especially for like kind of enterprise companies who want Twitter data or whatever data for like public kind of APIs like that. If they want data, it's probably going to be easier for them if it's through a REST endpoint, because those like large companies would also have to switch to GraphQL, which is right. It seems like they probably won't, but maybe that would be cool. But so yeah, it's mostly used for that, and it's powered by the GraphQL, our GraphQL server, because we already ended up providing a lot of the data that that team needed to build out those REST endpoints.
Got it. And is that an almost like a automated service thing that you kind of have a declarative setup where you have like, here's my REST endpoint, here are the query parameters that the REST endpoint will take, and you kind of take those parameters and map them into variables in like a templated GraphQL query. You know what I mean?
That sounds really cool, but that is not what we do. It's pretty new. So it's like very specific and like very like by hand. Like it's like when you're working with like a third party companies, it's like you're only allowed like these 4 things. I think some of them are maybe a little cooler than that, but yeah, it's a little by hand.
Got it. That makes sense. Yeah, but I feel like that REST API creator thing is quite exciting though. It'd be like, just because it seems like a very straightforward thing to add to any GraphQL service, right? It's kind of just a new kind of way of doing persistent queries. Yeah, that's interesting. I think those are all of the things that I wanted to discuss. Any questions that you have for each other, Eve, Alex, Sasha?
Yeah, I have a question. If we're talking about like backend stuff, this is just more of an explorative question. But one of the things about GraphQL on the front end is we get so much awesome stuff out of automation. So it's like if there's great tools like you design a schema, will automatically create a model to save the schema and so on and so forth. What type, when it comes to using GraphQL in the backend, especially if you're thinking from like a middleware to middleware situation, what, like, is there a way that GraphQL can be utilized, because we do have the types and stuff, to automatically compose and automatically put together pieces or instances on the back end or something like that? And then my second question was like the mutations. They seem like the mutation is almost kind of like the command pattern, right? Because you have a mutation, the mutation has a name, and then you get a payload of data with the mutation. Do you see, like, what types of things do you see us doing in just a back end, internal API world with like mutations? Will we get to the point that, like, instead of writing, I don't know, a series of commands in Bash or something like that, that we're like actually have like, here, follow these mutations and then spit out this query or something? Those are just things that I was like hypothetically curious of, because we do get out of the front end back end communication, we get a lot of automation and cool stuff. And how can you apply that to an internal situation?
Yeah. I have a few thoughts, but Sasha, do you have any thoughts that would like take that?
Not any thoughts that we probably haven't already covered. So.
Yeah, I think you're spot on in the sense like that mutation pattern is very like a command pattern. And I really I think that's something that's resonated with people as well, because when they think about, instead of thinking about like if you think about like more of like the platform use case to GraphQL, more than the resolvers, what you're really interested in is the entities and the actions on those entities. That your framework is not, you're not really thinking of resolvers and like how I can fetch the best set of resolvers or compose all of the resolvers or like create that GraphQL query for a good data fetch on my app. But what you're really looking at doing is you're thinking about things in terms of entities and the actions on those entities. And then in that case, it works out really well, especially for mutations or transactions, to be like, here's an action on this entity, right? Like create health record, or like delete health record, or reassign, or whatever, right? So it's very, that terminology is very appealing to think of things in terms of entities and actions on entities. So there's a good fit there. I think from the kind of enterprise integration standpoint, I do feel like integrating a GraphQL API is pretty much the same as integrating a REST API. I mean, there's not too much of a difference, right? It's just that like instead of having a URL path-based thing, it's more like you have a URL and then you give it a payload. But in terms of like what you have to do with the output, right? If you had like a Swagger specific or an Open API or Swagger spec to your REST API, you would probably have some automation on the client that would kind of take that Swagger spec and generate like a Java class or something for that REST output. Or maybe you just deal with that raw JSON object and then I don't know, like get attribute, whatever dynamic thing you want to do. And I feel like GraphQL is not better or worse. If anything, it's probably better because there is an opportunity for more standardized tooling than what OpenAPI and Swagger gave us, which was a little bit like, which tried to be very standard, but I think it's still not very standard. I mean, there's still like variations here and there. So I think from that point of view, there's definitely like a huge opportunity for GraphQL to add a lot of value in these kind of like business, like service to service or business to business or team to team integrations, right? And I'm very excited about that. But like I see, like for me, from my experience, most of the barriers are just like building that GraphQL service and convincing people to do GraphQL is very hard. It almost seems really sad, and like as a quote unquote vendor in the GraphQL ecosystem, saying this in public should not be a thing that I say, but it's like the whole world has continuously made things simpler, right? Like we made things simpler when we went from SOAP to REST. But from REST to GraphQL, the complexity does increase a little bit. It's a little bit worrying, right? It's like a little bit worrying because like even things like, for example, if you think like Lambda and serverless, right? They work really well with REST endpoints. But that entire story doesn't work with GraphQL, because with GraphQL, the sheer amount of like runtime stuff that you need to do, the query caching, the state that you need to maintain within a request and across requests is so much that a serverless like environment would just not, like, it doesn't work well, right? With like the Lambda style of like that innovation that's happening on the Lambda ecosystem, right? Where it's, oh, here's the REST API. It's a tiny function. It has no state. But you can't do that with GraphQL because you have to do so much work with GraphQL before you get to the processing of the query. So that worries me a little bit. Yeah, I don't know how to go delete this on YouTube, but anyway, that's me.
I think that right there kind of points out, and I think this took me like forever to realize myself, but like the main selling point of GraphQL it's like developer productivity. It's like your client engineers, like everyone's going to be able to make, things faster. Like they can develop products and features so much faster, but like a lot of like everything else becomes more complicated, even to the point where, and I probably shouldn't be saying this, but like, at Medium, you were like, okay, everything's going to be way faster. This is going to be awesome. And that's not necessarily true. And it took me so long to figure that out. It's like some things will be faster, but some things won't. And it's kind of like the average of everything is going to be easier. And overall, I think maybe faster. But like if you choose a specific endpoint, now you're writing a query for it, that might be slower. It might 100% be slower. And I think that's something that is kind of it was hard for me to like really understand. It's like, okay, this is about developer productivity and like making things faster, and it's so much easier. And then the price you have to pay is like a lot of other things are harder. And I think, like with the Lambda stuff, it's like, now that's harder, but like, your client developers are like way happier. So like,
That's true. Yeah, I think that's exactly the thing.
A lot of it's learning curve based too. Right. Yeah. Because like I felt like I got into a groove of building apps, in particular with like Redux, like managing client state and stuff like that. I got into such a groove that I built apps faster than I could ever build them, like using TDD, BDD and stuff. And then I got into GraphQL and it slowed me down. Everything got slower. But then the more I use it, the more I conquer that learning curve. Now I'm just as fast as I would have been previously, but I did have to like get over this curve. I had to learn all of this stuff. I had to do a bunch of stuff wrong and to figure out like what the process is. But now if I need to do something, I never think like, oh, I'm going to put up a REST endpoint. It's just immediately, bam, this is the schema. Let me start building these resolvers. And I argue that like, I think it's just as fast once you get past that learning curve when you're building it. But it is real syntax heavy. So there's that whole thing, like writing out all the syntaxes in a query.
You're definitely writing more code. You're definitely writing a little more code than you would have written, right? But I think keeping in line with the theme of like the GraphQL contributor day stuff that we've been doing, it's nice to end on like this therapeutic note where this is more a GraphQL therapy group more than like a GraphQL anything else. Like, so I think that's good. But yeah, I think in just terms of like wrapping this conversation up, do you folks have picks that you would like to share with technical, non-technical, just things to do in quarantine? What's your latest quarantine busting trip? How's the lockdown situation for you folks and what have you been doing about it? But any picks related to that for people who've tuned in would be super nice. Eve, Alex, would you like to go first? I feel like
I got a pick, so I can go.
Go for it.
There's an alpha. I don't know if you have VR, but if you have virtual reality or Oculus, there's an alpha for a program called Microdose, which is really awesome. And they opened their alpha to Corona for now, so like more people can join this alpha program and install it. And it's kind of like a visual, like concert art style VR thing, but it's a lot of fun. You just paint like all of these fractals and everything in a VR space, and that's been a fun thing to play with for sure. It's like a really cool.
You had me at microdosing. So
several hours in VR you can do.
But you can look up the Microdose Alpha and join the program. It's free, and then you can also help like influence the direction of the software. But it's pretty cool stuff.
That's awesome. Eve.
What do I have? I don't even know. Sasha, you go, and then I'll come up with something.
Okay, I don't have anything too exciting, but one is I've found that going outside is very important. You think that you shouldn't go outside, but you should. You should definitely go outside and like take a walk. Also, lots of Animal Crossing. I recommend it. So there you go. Those are my tips.
Definitely. Going outside is something that feels like you shouldn't do it, but it's very good for your mental health. We went and stood in a field yesterday and it was very good for us. It was very like just nice to look at a tree, see what's going on out there. So
we also got some interesting advice too. I guess another pick of ours would be a pulse oximeter. We had a really good friend that got really sick from this virus, and he's a super healthy, like trail runner, skier type dude. So it was really surprising. But what saved his life was the fact that he had a pulse oximeter. So if you catch corona and you're kind of worried and you're wondering if there's something you could do, you kind of check your network and see if there's a pulse oximeter, because that gave them the reading to know when he needed to go to the emergency room. And his wife was monitoring it, but when his oxygen levels dropped below 90, she called their doctor friend and they were like, take him now. So it's like, I know that it's like a scary time and a scary thing, but I feel like if there's something that you can do, I guess they were a little bit easier to come by before this, but yeah, pulse oximeter is another one of our picks.
That's right. That sounds pretty crazy. But yeah, you folks are lucky. I think in my case, I've been I was in India for a few weeks, and I was going to come back to San Francisco, but I couldn't because there was a travel ban. And in India, there's like a national lockdown. So you're not supposed to step outside your house unless you have to go buy groceries. So unfortunately, I can only look at animals from my balcony, but that does help. Like just looking at like open spaces definitely helps. So yeah. Anyway, on that bittersweet note, thank you so much for being here, Eve, Alex, Sasha, and hope to see you online. And thank you for everybody who's tuned in. Hope this was useful. Bye, everyone.
Cool.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.